Hello, everyone, and welcome to our book talk. My name is Aska Hisa, and I am the Director of Learning and Engagement at ICALA. And we're here to look at a newly released book titled, Culture Strike, Art and Museums in an Age of Protest. Our guests are Laura Raicovich, the author, who is joined by another author of powerful reading, Jeff Chang. If you are someone who visits and enjoys museums, supports them at any level, or wonders how art institutions can manage to remain relevant in the 21st century, this book is recommended reading. We are in an age of protest, and we are kept in chaos with a global pandemic. These are states of being for the time being. And what are we going to do? We are protesting for important reasons. We are put to the test, and we put each other to the test. And in my educator brain, I can only look at these times, as difficult as they are, as a learning opportunity. This book examines the current controversies around museums and the tensions that mirror larger systemic issues in our society, from a reckoning of colonial history, racism, and inequity, to name a few. This book, like many of this nature, is the stuff of seminars. Alas, we only have an hour together, and so we'll try to focus on some solutions and hope that it will prompt you to want to read more and keep discussing so that we reach the goal of learning in order to better serve, and in the author's words, create a more engaged and equitable civic realm. We're sharing long form bios in the chat. There's a document there. And so here I go with a little bit of background about our speakers. In addition to writing Culture Strike, Laura Raicovich is a singular leader in the arts and culture sector who is dedicated to art and artistic production that relies on complexity, poetics, and care to create a more engaged and equitable civic realm. She most recently served as interim director at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art, a museum devoted to queer art and artists. Until early 2018, she was the president and executive director of the Queen's Museum, where she oversaw an inviting and vital commons for art, ideas, and engagement. Prior to the Queen's Museum, she was a force at Creative Time New York, where she oversaw such projects as Creative Time's Global Initiatives, Creative Time Reports, and the Creative Time Summit. She has served as deputy director at Dia Art Foundation and was a key team member for the establishment of Dia Beacon in upstate New York. She is the recipient of both the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Fellowship and the inaugural Emily H. Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators at Hyperallergic, where some of the writing for Culture Strike began to take shape. Jeff Chang has written extensively on culture, politics, and the arts and music. He is the author of such award-winning books as Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, which currently has a new edition for young adults, Who We Be, The Colorization of America, and We Gon' Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation. He has been a USA Ford Fellow in Literature and a winner of the North Star News Prize. He co-founded Culture Strike, not to be confused with Laura's book, which is now known as Center for Cultural Power, a woman and artist-led organization for equity, and he co-founded Color Lines, an online journal. He has also served as executive director for the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University, and Jeff currently serves as senior advisor at Race Forward, an organization supporting the fight for racial equity. So thank you both for being here. Thank you all out there for tuning in. Let's get started. So we're gonna talk about what? Museums. So I thought it'd be nice to sort of warm up with hearing from Jeff about his experience with museums.
Thanks, Aska, for this amazing event. Thanks all of you for attending, and thanks most of all to you, Laura. Congratulations on getting this book published. And it just feels like it's so important to have your work out in this moment, which feels like I just don't think that there's ever been a moment like this, actually, where the museums have been challenged. The sort of institution of the museum has been challenged. Um, and and really pushed, right, to do better and to make good sort of its role in society, to advance equity and justice. So the book is really really key because I think that you raise all of the main issues that we actually are confronting in this particular period, with a whole lot of hope and optimism, which I think I struggled even, as hopeful and that kind of thing as I am, sometimes with I would really love for us to kind of talk a little bit more about what keeps you hopeful. Maybe that's something that we can ask later. But one of the things that we've seen over the last decade has been this sort of first belated and reluctant interest in looking at questions of racial equity, um, and that being forced by millions of people in the streets. That question being forced by millions of people in the streets, and I think that of late, I think that museums have been challenged really to not just look at questions of underrepresentation, race, and equity, but to actually examine what it means to advance cultural justice. And I think that we've done a lot of work with many big name museums um, over the last, especially, I'd say 4 or 5 years, in trying to advance equity and also see if we can move folks, to working on questions of cultural justice. And in a lot of ways, folks are doing this because that's what their publics are telling them to do. Um, and as they've come closer and closer to the heart of having to deal with these questions because of circumstances that are happening outside of their doors, they've been forced to confront what it means, behind their doors, to sort of retool themselves, really for their futures, for the future of the institution of the museum. And so that's been happening in such a dramatic way, and in such an unparalleled type of way, and so fast, that we do need to kind of have this moment to be able to say what are the questions that we really want to try to get at. And I just feel like your book is such a fantastic contribution to that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I was so honored that you're here tonight, talking with us about the book, and just thanks for being cool with me using Culture Strike as the name of the book too, because we
Yeah.
did check in because I was like Culture Strike, and then I was like, but that's a thing. And
But Andy was your editor, and you're
yeah,
close to Ken, and
yeah, yeah.
Ravi, and all of us from Culture Strike. So it's
Just it felt like
wonderful.
the right vibe.
Yeah.
And thanks, Oscar, for being so generous and hosting this event. It really means a great deal to me that that I'm doing the first museum event for Culture Strike with the ICA in LA. I think it just says a lot about the ICA and how you all look at yourselves in the context of these struggles, because they are struggles, right? Part of my interest in this book was to attend to the things that are embedded in our systems that people don't see anymore because they're so enmeshed. And of course, there are all kinds of interesting conversations we could have about complicity, but I think
Mm.
there are some there are very specific underlying histories in the ways in which the museum developed in the United States that I wanted to get at. And that was primarily around this question of museum neutrality, because there were moments throughout my career, but particularly when I was at the Queen's Museum, where I was told things like, well, we have to be careful, we have to stay neutral.
Mhm.
And I was like, what does that mean exactly? Because I don't really think the museum has ever been a neutral space. It's always reflected the dominant culture in some very specific ways. And in fact, when you look at the specific history of the evolution of the United States museums, it comes very specifically, they come very specifically out of they're raced and classed and come out of a very specific educational space. And I thought it was important to talk about that as a way, as foundational to the institution, not to entirely discredit it. And this is getting to Jeff's question about optimism or pessimism about these structures. But I guess, you know, to me, it was important that we, at least at the very outset, if we wish to address inequity and cultural justice on any level, actually admitting the fact that these spaces are not neutral to begin with and never have been is an essential first step. Because if you're not even willing to do that, how are you going to even approach questions about equity and cultural justice? So, you know, to me, that was an important piece to kind of lay out, because I found that while on one hand, folks are like, oh my God, how can museums possibly think they're neutral? It's like 2021, you know, like, nope, everybody knows that they can't be neutral. But then on another hand, I was very surprised, and it helped me kind of explain what I meant about neutrality. And I talk about it in the book, about this organization called ICOM, which is like the International Committee on Museums or something like that. I don't remember exactly what the acronym is. What's it?
International Council
on Museums. And it's one of the biggest membership organizations for museums in the world. There are many, many hundreds of thousands, frankly, of museums who belong to this thing. And there was a very public argument about the definition of a museum. And it had gone from something very straightforward, like, it was about the preservation and
like Laura, if you want me to, I can read.
Oh, do you have it? Oh, that would be great. Can you read the
chat? So the definition in 2007, a museum is a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment.
So that was the first definition. And then a group of folks got together to say, okay, well, actually, we think we need to update this. And a proposal was made for some new language around this that was a little bit different.
I can read that one too.
Cool.
In the chat. So 2019, it's a little longer. Museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the futures. Acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Museums are not for profit. They are participatory and transparent and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being.
Well, that second proposal, holy shit, there was a major storm about it. There were people who were quitting ICOM, there were boycotts. It was like, this was so off the charts offensive. The second one was so off the charts offensive. Now, I mean, it may be it's a little bit wordy. It has some really beautiful ideas. It may, could maybe use a little bit of editing, but there's a lot of great stuff in there. But this was objectionable while the first one wasn't. And I think that to me, that's at the core of this problem with neutrality. The perception that the language, this kind of slightly distanced, not really addressing the humanity of people who actually produce culture in this kind of very staid lingo, said neutrality to people. Whereas it's not. This is a very specific type of discourse that's very tied to a certain type of credentialing, to a certain type of historiography, a certain type of storytelling. And the attempt to actually democratize that process and language, I think, was extremely was protested extremely, right? And I think, to me, that was like the crux of the problem, is that when you start to question the structures of the museum, you get these responses that are knee-jerk. They're not content-based. They don't have a basis in what historical and contemporary realities are. And when you actually look at who created many original museum collections, it's pretty clear. Like some older white dude who had a lot of money, collected stuff that he liked, and eventually he either had too much of it and didn't want to store it, or he died and his kids didn't want to deal with it. And so somebody was like, hey, but this is really like primo stuff, like let's put it in a museum. And so they donated it to like his alma mater or something, because obviously he went to university with a museum. And then it became part of some elite collection, which then was studied by generations of aspiring art historians and curators and others. And so it becomes like by default what is excellent. And in point of fact, this is just like one dude's taste. It's like what one guy liked and what he was exposed to and what he was introduced to and what he had experience with. Like, he might not have known that he was like a great lover of flamenco because he never experienced flamenco, but who knows, he might have been. So anyway, my point is that these collections come from very narrow demographic spaces. And so, of course, they're biased. Of course, the study and the credentialing is biased. The tradition of it comes from these very narrow spaces. And so you have to break that down before, in my opinion, you can really get to these questions of cultural justice that I think are supremely important. And so I felt like, in order to, because already, when when I was 3 years ago, when I started working on this book, already this language of equity and inclusion was coming, and there was the big study in New York City about, racial representation on staffs of museums, et cetera, was coming out, and everybody was talking about this stuff, but it was it was a very surface conversation, because there was this resistance to seeing it as structural. Right. And I wondered, Jeff, if like that has been your experience, because I think that, you were really in full swing when this discussion began, several years ago. And, I'd be curious to hear like your take on like how you get at that reality,
Yeah, I really appreciate you kind of taking us back to the beginnings of, the museum, the rise of the museum. And if we put it into an American context, that really takes us to the heart of these questions of cultural justice. Let me start. Let me start maybe with what you're talking about here, which is Tom Finkelpearl's charge, right, from the DCA, the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York City, to ask all of the arts nonprofits that they fund to give demographic information, right? And the thing that struck me at that particular time, I was writing and finishing a book called Who We Be, that was looking at really the colorization, the shift that occurred within the arts and culture sector over the last 50 years, from the 60s into the 2000s. And what struck me was when Tom, who was your predecessor, of course, at the Queens Museum, right? When he made this request of folks, there was pushback. People didn't really want to give that information up. They didn't want to see what was going on, um, and uh, and even further than that, there had not been any of that demographic information collected since the last time there were a lot of protests, right? Which was the late '80s into the early '90s, because of the rise of sort of a new generation at that time of artists of color, largely
Mhm.
women artists, a lot of queer artists as well. Um, so the report in and of itself revealed what we all know now, right? Um, Revealed that in a city that was two-thirds folks of color, that over 80 to 90% of leadership in museums was white. Um, and that was really interesting to me because that was sort of, okay, now we're talking about equity. But equity is only a marker, right? It's only a measure of how far folks have gotten towards justice. And so it was still, uh, at that particular point, um, just not even getting into what you're able to get into in your book, which is the questions of justice, to talk about how the museum uh, in American society came up in the late 19th century as a way of preserving whiteness, right? And as a way of actually creating a certain sense of American culture as being white and comparable to European culture, right? To be able to lift up American culture, in other words, to put it on a pedestal next to European culture. So
So just so
I just think,
I want to add to that,
yeah.
just because I think that's a really important point, and then I'll be quiet.
No,
But
no, no, please don't be quiet.
but the
Please continue to speak up.
I mean, the European piece is really essential because um, obviously in the colonial settler um, move of the United States, it was to bring European culture to the New World, and we know that it's not like there wasn't an ancient and overflowing amount of culture already in place on the territories on which we sit, each of us in slightly different geographies. And, I think that from a European perspective, what was interesting is that in Europe, the church and royalty, created the museum to a large degree. Whereas in the United States, it was like the wealthy private individual. And this is where capitalism is like the between capitalism, white supremacy, and the settler colonial piece, you have this triad of um, of of incredible power that
Mhm.
is not only um, committed to reifying itself through the venue of the museum, but also of using the museum to communicate the power of the United States, not only internally, but also internationally. And so you see, even just iconographically, the museum, the architecture of the museum mimicking the kind of ancient Greek and Roman architectures of Europe, putting itself literally in those legacies, and also containing literal loot from from colonial culture,
Mhm.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So those things are like, they're so embedded. And and it's funny because I get this question all the time, particularly about universal museums, like, well, aren't these spaces supposed to be for everybody? They're universal, whatever. And I'm always like, well, think about it though. If okay, fine, great, like I love going to the Met. I'm sorry. And I love going to the Met and checking out, the African art section of the Met because they have incredible holdings, right? But maybe it would be a little bit different if, like, I was going to France and I was actually from Nigeria, from the Kingdom of Benin, and I saw all of these incredible Benin bronzes, so-called Benin bronzes, for the first time in my life
Mhm.
because there weren't any in Benin.
Mhm.
Like, what would that feel like? Suddenly, I'm not included in that universal thing.
Mhm.
Like, I have a different relationship to those objects. And it's kind of fucked up at that point,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, it depends on your removed relationship from the works that are gathered.
Right.
So I don't know, and that's a very specific thing to universal museums and with particularly around questions of repatriation of artworks. But I think it's so important to kind of think it through in those terms, because that's the material reality of what we're talking about in those galleries,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and for somebody whose culture that is, it's being represented, the appearance of the Benin bronzes or, you know, Pacific Islander or Asian artifacts in that museum out of their context depends on them being alienated from me, right? I'm just to bring it back down, like this idea of cultural justice
That's right.
to a personal type of level, right?
Yeah.
The notion of cultural justice is really about restoring and making clear and plain what's been taken away, right? The suppression, the marginalization, the erasure of cultures, of people's cultural practices and expressions, right? And that this is cumulative, right? That this is something that resonates for folks over, you know, half a millennium, right? And that this is the point that we actually find ourselves now at in thinking about the museums in this particular type of moment. And so here's where I ask the money question, I guess, or maybe it's too early to ask the money
Oh, no,
question.
let's do it.
But you know, the question, right, is if we understand this to be the history of the museum, um, then why do we want to maintain it? Why do we want to continue to maintain it as it is? And this is something where I I I'm just so deeply moved in your book by the sort of investment that you place in having cultural spaces. Uh, but can we move forward with all of these types of problems? A half century, right, of cultural justice to make up, let alone move forward, right? So
I mean, I think
that's really the question.
that's a really important question. It's one that I have struggled with, you know, over these last years, and even kind of maintaining my own optimism about cultural spaces. And I guess I think that the conclusion that I came to, or not the conclusion, but where my thinking is right now is that, you know, there is a system of cultural infrastructure. It
Mhm.
is decidedly broken, right? Like, I think some of us are questioning whether it's retrievable. Some of us have already decided it's not retrievable.
Mm.
Um, my feeling is that I'm not sure all of it's retrievable, but I think that so much human investment, human capital, intellectual capital, so many resources have been put into these spaces. And that I think it's sort of a shame not to reutilize them, even if they're really radically repurposed. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that, I think, as you said when you started, Jeff, like that's the money question is at the heart of this notion of can they be radically transformed? Can there be a radical transformation? And, you know, I think that part of, I started really thinking about that a couple of years ago is like, how do you change the money thing? Because, you know, in the US, there is no federal culture ministry, there's no national cultural policy. There's this kind of weak shadow agency called the National Endowment for the Arts that's always on the chopping block, and it's like a pathetic amount of money anyway. And so, like, why does that? I mean, it's a pathetic amount of money, but like we're all so precarious that we like die for the good housekeeping seal of approval of that damn $25,000 NEA grant, right?
Mhm.
And you know, and then I started thinking about the IMLS, which is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is a very different kind of organization, part of the federal government, but they give much larger sums. And I don't want to say this too loud in front of any Republicans, but that program has kept more cultural spaces alive, especially through really kind of difficult to fund initiatives, particularly around educational programs and other more experimental things. Not that they're the most adventurous organization, don't get me wrong, and a lot of people, it can be very conservative, and I've only ever gotten one of those grants once, so it's not like everybody gets them and all of that, but it's not insignificantly funded, and that's partially because they're funding basically museum and library infrastructure. That's how it's framed. And so, in a sense, my question to myself was like, okay, how do we build the desire or the political possibility of even having the United States take ownership in some way, the public of the United States actually desire to have public infrastructure for culture? And what would that look like? How could that even be accomplished? And so I started talking with some colleagues at Hyperallergic and the Brooklyn Public Library, and we came up with this idea to do, it was the end of 2019, it was the end of my fellowship at Hyper, and we started talking about the census. And we came up with this idea of doing an art and society census to have a really wide-ranging and open conversation, or to initiate a potentially wide-ranging and open conversation about culture in the city of New York through the Brooklyn Public Library system. Of course, we were imagining this happening through the 65 different branches and the different neighborhoods that could be engaged through the kind of beauty of that dispersed library system. And then COVID hit, so we had to kind of recalibrate. But we did put out the survey at the end of 2020. It ended up being a digital survey. You can still find it on the Brooklyn Public Library website. I don't think you can submit your survey responses any longer, because we've closed that, and we're beginning to do the deep analysis now. But right away we looked at the first couple thousand responses, and it was very clear that people wanted to talk about a couple of things. They wanted to talk about money. They wanted to talk about what is the local, like where does the museum intersect with the local. They wanted to talk about how you encounter the museum, like what are the protocols, what is this like in and out. And they also wanted to talk about what needed to change. So we set up 4 different working groups to address these questions with facilitators. They were totally public working groups. Anyone could sign up for them. They each spent 10 hours together talking through these questions. And at the end of it, we kind of compiled the kind of major threads in the thinking into a document that's a working document. It's not like a finished thing, but it's called the Proclamation on Life and Art, and that was presented at an event last June. And so this is an ongoing iterative process with the goal of being able to talk through these issues and kind of distill them enough that they become something that we can hand to the next mayor of New York City, who will be elected in November, as well as the 2/3 of the city council that's turning over, as a fresh way of thinking about culture. And I'm trying to work with both Laundromat Project and Strike MoMA, because both of them have had really interesting programs around kind of soliciting and eliciting these kinds of ideas from their publics. And we kind of, we're like a weird Venn diagram where we overlap, but we don't totally overlap. So I was like, oh, it would be cool. So we're going to talk about doing that. But these are iterative processes that need to continue. But what was really fascinating about this was that people wanted to participate from all over the United States. Like we have people calling in for the public working groups from California and from Maine and from Michigan and all this other stuff. It was totally cool. And so, on one level, I was like, well, maybe a national conversation about culture and what we desire from our cultural spaces is possible. And if you could do that, then I think you could have a radical transformation of cultural space. And not every cultural space is going to change,
Yeah.
The changes are going to be different based on the DNA of each cultural space. And the ICA in LA has different work to do from the Met. So I think that's appropriate and important. But just to say, that opens the door to having even a percentage like a tiny percentage of 1% of, say, that giant infrastructure bill, the $3 trillion bill that just got passed by Congress and put forward by the president. Imagine if cultural infrastructure could get like one teensy weensy percentage of a percent. It would be transformative in terms of rebalancing the public financial interest in cultural space and the private financial interest in cultural space. And if we could have a national conversation about that and reinvest in the public's imagination, their relationship to that cultural space, as diverse as it might be, whether it's a community center or, you know, a universal museum like the Met or LACMA or whatever, you know, I think that that's really important. And this is the thing that always keeps me optimistic, Jeff. And I guess this comes to the heart of it, right? Is I think like we all like want to use our imagination. Like there's a basic like human craving to do that. And like creativity is like in all of us, you know, and I think that there is such a desire to participate in some kind of cultural offering that both is reflective of like my particular identity where I see myself, but also that completely challenges me to imagine something radically different. And so I think that those parallel twin desires are just so out there, you know, that they're so powerful for folks that I think that for me is what, you know, people desire these spaces, and we have the infrastructure. Let's just use it differently. I think that's possible, but only if we can have this kind of really big shift on the national level, because I do think that it's predicated upon a public investment in cultural infrastructure in a way that could retune the balances of power.
Yeah, that's really powerful point, that to have and to sort of have a flowering of the American imagination, you need infrastructure, and to have infrastructure, you need investment. That's just so powerful. And I'm really, really happy that you're lifting that point up, and that you're all doing this amazing work in New York, and hopefully this will, you know, kind of take hold and spread around the country. One of the things that it makes me think of is that, you know, at its peak, the NEA was giving out nearly $1 billion a year, right? In 2020 dollars, it'd be nearly $1 billion a year. And this money went towards building the infrastructure of arts organizations, the sort of storefront arts organizations, the sort of theaters that you'd see in small towns and big towns, and the sort of watering holes and the sort of hubs and inspiration kind of places for what became this huge breakthrough in the 80s and 90s of queer artists, of women artists, and artists of color.
That's right.
That all of these folks came up through an infrastructure that wasn't like really expensive art school, right? And that people were able to kind of experience art in their neighborhoods, in their communities. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it advanced us to the point that we're able now to kind of have this kind of conversation. And the time that it happened before in U.S. history, of course, is the fabled sort of investments of the New Deal,
That's
right?
right.
Which created literally, quote unquote, the imagination for the American century.
That's right.
However you want to feel about the concept of the American century, and I definitely feel some sorts of ways about that.
Yeah.
But you know, the brilliant artists, everybody from Ansel Adams to Jackson Pollock, Dorothea Lange, to Orson Welles, and everybody,
And
Zornia,
many more people who you've literally never ever heard of.
but whose work is so key to the way that we imagine, or did imagine, I think, our country. Now, having said that,
Yeah, go.
The question that I have though is, you know, is it possible in I think what's happened in the last 5 years is there's been a lot of powerful and extremely visible, and I think that you cover this so well in the book, um, protests of pieces that get at the ethical challenges, the ethical contradictions, I think is the way that you put it, of uh, of a system that's really just funded by wealthy people, right?
Right.
And obviously, like on the ground level, when we're doing equity trainings, that's part of our argument. We're like, you guys, like your audiences don't look at all, they look like you. They don't look like the audiences of the future. They don't look like the US. They don't look like America. Um, I guess my question is how do we bridge that? How do we bridge to that particular moment from the work that you're doing, sort of on the grassroots level, and then what is the role for cultural spaces in being able to kind of help usher in that change?
It's such a good point. So I think I have so many things to say about this. I think the first thing that I want to say is that I think by and large, a lot of very well-intentioned people have done a lot of very good work in terms of changing or beginning to shift the representation within the gallery space, right? Like whose work is in those spaces. I think that that's been done really intentionally by a lot of organizations. And I think that's to be super commended. But I also think that without doing the structural work that lies behind what appears in the galleries, you don't get very far.
Mm,
And that when you're seeking to create cultural justice, or even to begin to create cultural spaces that will, by the time the United States is minority white, which, you know, maybe 2036, I don't, you know, like the date changes every few months, I feel like, but, you know, I think that that shifting those structures that underlie um, the representation piece in the galleries is a very different question, because I think it's relatively easy to 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 make a very concerted decision to include more by POC in the galleries, or, you know, in the public programs especially. I think that's, you know, been very
mhm,
clear. I think where it's harder to do is in a non-tokenistic way to shift the systems within the museum to ensure that you're actually making that change fundamentally and not just doing it on the surface of who you pick for stuff, right? And who's, so then you have to ask who's doing the picking, who's doing the governing, who's doing the rule making, who's doing the rule breaking, who's doing the rule redoing. And that gets into not only diversification of staff, because as you and I have talked about, I mean, diversity of staff is like, I mean, that's entry level. You know, what we need to do is radically shift the way that things are done. If you don't recreate your operations on an equitable basis through a cultural justice lens, you are not going to actually get the work done in the way that I think it has to be done in order for it to actually promote cultural justice. So, you know, so the tough work, and this is where we get into the crux of it, right? It's like, this is the really hard work. You know, this is the really hard work. And what has to happen there is that we have to slow down,
mm,
because no one can produce at the level of programming that's being produced currently, even under COVID, even yada yada, and possibly devote any real energy. Because I know I've been inside so many different cultural spaces. There is not one cultural institution that I've even gotten remotely close to where people were like, yeah, whatever, I got lots of free time. That doesn't happen. People are like worked within an inch of their lives. And so if they're working their asses off trying to produce shit, how the heck are they going to talk about these really embedded, deep questions that rubs so intimately in our own conceptions of ourselves and who we are, and who we are in our own self, and who we are with our colleagues, with our families? I mean, this is like some very important stuff, you know, and it's got to start internally, and it's then got to be worked out with colleagues. I mean, Jeff, like, all of this is what you do, like you do this, but and I think there is a kind of some kind of fantasy that this work can be done, through a couple of retreats, or
Mhm.
kind of a few sessions with some really good people and whatever. And there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot more around how we have to reimagine how we want to be together as humans. Like, how do we want to be together? And then remake those relationships in order to actually do that. And that's why I think the slowing down piece is really important. And on top of that, I think there are also artists who are working actively in this space of reimagining how we are together, or how we could be together, that can help us get to that other space. So how can culture help in this process? We both help culture itself, but also potentially help the bigger space of society. Well, let's use our cultural spaces as the training grounds, as let's produce the culture that we want to see by being together and doing this work as cultural production.
Mhm.
Let's name it,
Mhm.
and do that. And
Mhm.
that will be the culture. Why not? It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be this separate thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels so critical to be able to name that it's not just about sort of creating pipeline programs and sort of, like reaching out and having, committees or that kind of stuff in which you have artists or community people engage. Although we need all of that, absolutely. We need different policies. We need policies that don't screen out people from jump. Um, we need different practices. We need different protocols. We also, as you're saying, need to be working on the organizational culture of cultural organizations, right?
Right.
And the beautiful thing about it is, yes, it feels like this has been not just a moment of protest, as you're talking about an age of protest, but it's also an age where people are really trying to experiment with that. And
Yeah.
if you could talk about some of those experiments that you think have real potential to be able to scale up to transform the culture.
I mean, I think there it's like there are things that are like so obvious and easy that everybody should just do them. Like, um, printing the salary on any job listing. It's like, not all organizations do this. This is a profound equity issue. It's also relieves you of lots of wasted time and screening candidates who can't possibly take a job for that little money and whatever. But let's just be like, put that one aside for a sec. There are all kinds of incredible ideas that have also come out of this art and society census project that we did, like, figuring out a way to include participatory budgeting, which, like, New York City has embraced in the by community board in the museum structure, whether that's internally by the staff or externally by community members. What does that look like?
Mhm.
Challenging the idea that the museum is always the uh, educational and educating voice,
Mhm.
and that the public can actually be the knowledge keepers and the knowledge holders, that they might have important knowledges to provide to other publics of the museum and the museum itself, that the expertise is not unidirectional. you
Mhm.
know and
Mhm.
of course, education departments have been ahead of this game for a very long time in kind of breeding these much more exchange oriented methodologies and pedagogies. But the museum in general has not adopted that, and that is something that is, like, critically important. um, um, Paying people,
Mhm.
just paying people to do the work of the museum, paying people to do uh, paying people.
Mhm.
I think that's really important. Um, Paying people a living wage also. I think unions are the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this piece of the puzzle. And I think, the kind of knee-jerk resistance to unionization has to be really examined for what it is, which is that unions have been a vehicle to preserve capitalism to a large degree. Because this is a somewhat controversial statement, but just hear me out for a sec. Because in a sense, unions make it possible for the working conditions to be bearable enough to sustain whatever the production is of that, whatever those worker, whatever that labor produces. So if the conditions were so terrible that the union couldn't, that perhaps the workers would refuse, right? And so the union actually makes it bearable for both, right? And so in one sense, I would say that I really like the idea of, I think that the protest, the unionization effort is a radical form of care that needs to be listened to in a different way than it usually is listened to. And I understand, I've been there. When people protest your institution, you're like, oh my God, I'm working my ass off. And now there's a protest. What the fuck am I gonna do about this? And then you're like panicked and like, my funding is gonna go away and yada, yada. And so there are all these like external things where a better reaction, which is a very hard thing to summon, might be to really deeply listen to what either your staff is saying, what is it that they really need? What is the union desiring? What is actually at the crux of this conversation? And how can we be transparent enough, speaking as a senior administrator and former museum director, how can I do my job better to be able to be transparent enough that everybody who works in the museum understands the way it actually functions? Because it's so layered right now that like most people within a museum don't even understand the way that the budgets work, or like don't even receive a copy of the full budget. Everywhere I've ever worked, I've said everybody needs the whole budget. You don't just get your like itty bitty little department thing and wonder like, gosh, how it magically nets up into whatever. I want everyone to understand what it means when we say, oh, the gala didn't do well, or the such and so 2008 happens and the foundations are cutting back all their giving. Like, what does that actually do to a budget? I want people to understand that that's important. We're in this together, right? This is a collective enterprise. This is not this mythology of the kind of shining beacon that magically runs itself through the aegis of a genius director or curator combo. Like, this isn't reality. The reality is that museums are profoundly collective. They need to be understood from the bottom up, not from the top down. And they need that kind of radical transparency, especially around the money stuff. So anyway, that's a lot, but there's so much more. I mean, this is the thing, is like, once you start scratching the surface, you can be like, oh, and then there's another idea, And I think one of the most important things that I want to just reinforce that I say in the book is that part of the reason that I don't like lay out the definitive plan is that I do not believe that the definitive plan can come from one brain, or even just 3 brains like we have here tonight assembled, in addition to this mysterious audience that I know is out there. But even though I can't see you, I know you're there. But it would be so much more awesome if we were all pitching in those ideas together, and imagine what we could come up with then, and as we found out with the Art and Society census, there's some pretty fucking great ideas that come out when we actually talk to each other and spend some time together. And so even with a pandemic raging, we managed to do that over this bizarro land technology, and imagine what we could do if we could actually be together. So.
Great. I'm going to go now to questions because we need to hear from our people.
Yes, let's do it.
Exactly what we're talking about. I also want to give a shout out to all the amazing artists. You alluded to this, but the artists who know how it is in the museum and can see things differently and raise hell about it. And you mentioned a few examples in your book. We have to honor them, and many cultural workers in museums are artists. So there is this creative lens that can see things differently and reimagine the museum. And so that voice that comes first to perhaps dismantle, but also to rebuild is there. So let's see, we have a couple of questions so far. Um, What is the working definition of culture that allows people to discuss their cultural infrastructure, in your opinion? Do you see that question?
Yeah, I see it. Well, culture. I guess that's who we are together and what we make. You know, I use like the broadest possible definition for culture because I think it's sort of everything. Um, and um, and I think that different threads of cultural infrastructure support different types of work, right? So, like, you know, um, like Jeff was talking about, when the NEA started really focusing on not just giving money to the big cities, when they became committed to establishing community arts centers and supporting smaller theaters, queer-led, women-led, IPOC-led, it like really shifted in the late 80s and early 90s. It really shifted what was possible because that infrastructure existed. And I think that we want to define culture extremely broadly. And I also, by the way, don't think we need to limit it to the not-for-profit. And I will say why, because I think that there are many, many problems with the not-for-profit kind of scenario. And I think that it's funny because in some cases, if you're not, if you don't try to maximize profit, if that's not your driving force, you can run a for-profit entity and decide basically to kind of break even or just slightly more than break even. But you are far less regulated than a not-for-profit. And it's easier to incorporate. You could do it tomorrow. So, creating those types of infrastructures, vehicles for not just not-for-profit stuff, because also now there are foundations out there that will give to for-profit organizations that are not attempting to maximize profit in a kind of blatant way. There's nothing wrong with trying to earn income. In fact, it's been like the mantra of the nonprofit sector for a bajillion years now, where like you're forced to, get higher ticket sales because you're earning your income. That's like where the Blockbuster exhibition kind of took over in museums, was about this pressure on cultural spaces to earn income. So make a better shop, do a Blockbuster show, make sure your gift shop's on the way out. All of those things that corporatize the museum space from a physical point of view came from this pressure to function in a more obviously profit maximizing kind of vibe. So I would say define culture broadly and then provide the maximum diversity that suits the imaginations of a very, very broad public. And that's what we need. That's what we need cultural infrastructure to do. And just to say, I think that most cities have, and others, but cities in particular, have just the most wild diversity of cultural organizations that are out there, even with like zero public cultural infrastructure, or very little.
All right, if you see the other question, it was elaborated upon in a second post. It's someone who's having an issue with the local museum in the area, where it sounds like there's a problem.
And that sounds really tough. I mean, look, I will say this, I don't know enough about Jen, I don't know enough about your specific circumstance, but I will say that one of the big lessons for me in kind of doing a deep dive into particularly the Warren Kanders protests at the Whitney, who was the board member who owned a company that was actually, yes, it's true, called Safari Land, that made less deadly weaponry, meaning tear gas and other like rubber bullets and other things. And that tear gas was being used, it became very highly publicized because that tear gas was being used at the border by the Trump administration to push back asylum seekers, and it was also used in Ferguson. The same tear gas is also used in Palestine, Israel. It's used everywhere. Anyway, the point being that it became highly objectionable to a lot of people that this person who owned this company was on the board of the Whitney, and protests broke out. And protests not only broke out publicly, which I think was exceedingly important, but also broke out internally, to the point where the staff, 300 members of the staff, I think, no, 100 members of the staff, sorry, they signed a letter to the director talking about their own, like, it's a very tender letter, and I reproduced the entire thing in the book because I think it's really beautiful, but you can find it online. And really they talk about, like, well, how are we supposed to do our jobs? We understand our jobs as having to, you know, is to do this work of, you know, bringing the imagination to a very broad and diverse public. We represent that public. Many of us feel like we're part of the populations who are targeted in Ferguson and at the border. Like, how are we supposed to deal with that when we have this board member? And like, we need to understand how we contend with this contradiction within our institution. And it's a very genuine letter. And then simultaneously, there were external protests. There were kind of more weird conceptual art projects that were happening with, like, strange brochures that appeared out of nowhere, that kind of by an artist kind of collective called Dirt, that was compiling really interesting infographics and materials on kind of these internal contradictions around who the board members at the Whitney were, and like where the money was coming from, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally came the artist boycott of the Biennial. And, you know, at first there was one artist who decided not to participate, Michael Reykovic, and that was kind of like, he was sort of an anomaly, and there was a controversy even within that of, you know, who can decide not to participate and that kind of thing, the privileges that are granted to those who have other types of careers that, you know, don't necessarily require being represented in the Whitney Biennial, et cetera. It was going to be the most diverse biennial that there ever had been. And so folks also were like, why are you punishing the people who are finally in the biennial who haven't been there before? But then a number of artists halfway through said that if the museum didn't respond to the problem of this director, that they wanted their works withdrawn from the exhibition, including the artist Nicole Eisenman, who had won the prize, the Biennial Prize, the Bucksbaum Award, and had this giant work that would have been ridiculous to remove. And so all of those things layered, right? You had these public protests, these internal protests, these, you know, weekly protests at the museum. You had these, finally, the straw that broke the camel's back were these artists who, and when you have a museum that, you know, calls itself or thinks of itself as the artist museum, that's the thing that really, like, cut too close to the bone in that circumstance. And so Warren Kanders resigned. And the point of me telling you this in somewhat excruciating detail is just to say that it wasn't one thing. And these efforts were sometimes completely not coordinated, and that was fine. And the layering of the protest and how it happened and what level of listening happened to each one of those different groups, I think really made the difference. And I think we have to understand how we each play into our local ecologies of influence, right? And how we can best leverage our power, because we all have some power, to actually make that change possible. So I hope that helps, Jen.
Thank you, Laura, for that generous response and a peek into a part of your book. And this brings us to sort of the end of our program. Of course, there's so much more, as I said, to talk about. Please consider these books. And I mean, Laura's book and Jeff Chang's books as great books to have and to create more discussion around, make book club, do whatever it takes, because these are important things to read and to discuss. So thank you all for supporting our program and supporting this discussion. And thank you both for being part of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you. And Oscar, I'm so glad we got to do this together. Thanks for the support for the book. It's really deeply appreciated.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.